Restoring our oyster, cleaning our bay, preserving our future. This is the Oyster Recovery Partnership Mission. Also known as ORP and founded in 1994, the Oyster Recovery Partnership is a dedicated facilitator and implementer of all major oyster restoration activities for the state of Maryland and has become one of the largest groups actively restoring oysters in the Chesapeake Bay. Our restoration efforts have returned more than 2 billion oysters into the Chesapeake Bay, resulting in the reestablishment of 70 oyster reefs on 1,300 acres of bottom. The oyster business can be messy work, but the rewards are incredibly clean. Clean water, that is. Raw or Rockefeller, oysters aren't just good food. These animals are critical for the ecologic health of the Chesapeake Bay. Known as a keystone species, oysters not only filter our bay's dirty waters, but their reefs also provide habitat for other important marine life. Once world famous for its incredible supply of oysters, so numerous that they were a navigational hazard, the Chesapeake Bay has now lost more than 99% of its native oysters, and each year continues to lose more than 2,600 acres of oyster habitat. In fact, oyster reefs are the most threatened marine habitat on the planet. The bay's oysters used to filter all of the Chesapeake's waters in a matter of days. Now it takes more than a year. Without oyster reefs, our bay's health will continue to slowly collapse because the species that rely on oysters are suffering too. How did this happen? And what is being done to restore our bay? In the next few minutes, you will see the efforts of the Oyster Recovery Partnership to reclaim our bay. Along the way, you will learn about oyster history, importance, and life cycle, as well as current restoration strategies in Maryland. Although Maryland is for crabs, the oyster is certainly the Chesapeake Bay's unsung hero. A nutritional staple for thousands during the Great Depression and the cause of the violent oyster wars of the 1800s, raw oysters are a natural food source high in protein, zinc, selenium, and omega-3 fatty acids. Oysters were once so plentiful that early explorer John Smith's sailing vessels ran aground upon Chesapeake Bay oyster reefs. 100 years ago, oyster harvests exceeded 10 million bushels a year, but those days are long gone. Oyster-specific disease, historic overfishing, and the onslaught of silt and sediment, runoff, and degraded water quality have overwhelmed the remaining oyster reefs, leaving our harvest rates at just a fraction of what they once were. Not only has this impacted a major economic engine for many of our rural coastal communities, all but destroying a once thriving waterman culture, the bay's ecosystem is also under attack. Oysters serve as the kidneys of the bay by filtering silt, sediment, and nitrates out of the water. These mature animals can filter at a rate up to 50 gallons per day. With an oyster reef of just 1 million oysters, more than 50 million gallons of water can be cleaned in a single day. Just watch how an oyster effectively cleans the water in this tank. Oysters also act as engineers and architects that build natural reefs where much of the bay's marine life finds refuge, including the blue crab. The Chesapeake Bay is the largest estuary in the United States. Its health has far-reaching impacts on the livelihood of all parts of our local, regional, and national economy. Home to nearly 17 million people, the Chesapeake Bay watershed covers 6 states and more than 64,000 square miles. Certainly, the Chesapeake Bay is one of the country's most valuable natural treasures, offering countless recreational opportunities and supplying millions of pounds of seafood to the world each year. Our way of life is directly linked to a healthy bay. Oysters reproduce in the wild by releasing both sperm and eggs into the water column, producing larvae. Larvae drift with the bay's currents for several weeks before they settle onto the bottom of the bay and attach or set on hard substrate. A single female oyster can release 100 million eggs in a year, but without suitable substrate, preferably a shell on which to set, oyster larvae die. That's why the Oyster Recovery Partnership launched the Oyster Shell Recycling Alliance to collect used shells from restaurants and caterers from across the state and recycle them for new oyster habitat instead of having them go to a landfill. The shell is transported to the Horn Point Lab Hatchery in Cambridge, Maryland, where they are aged and cleaned to become a home to new baby oysters called spat. This spat-on shell is then replanted into the bay and creates a thriving oyster bed on the bay's floor, from which the new oysters, both from the hatchery and from Mother Nature, can grow. Maryland's oyster restoration strategy was formed by the Maryland Oyster Roundtable in 1993. The resulting action plan not only encouraged innovative approaches that utilized the University of Maryland Center for Environmental Science Horn Point Lab Hatchery's ability to produce disease-free oysters, but this plan also created the Oyster Recovery Partnership. Commissioned by a cause, ORP has successfully joined together state and federal government agencies, scientists, watermen, and conservation organizations toward the common goal of oyster restoration. Our science-based strategies focus on achieving high production rates at a low cost, while maximizing oyster survival to achieve a quality result. Significant numbers of plantings in recent years are leading the way to a viable future for the oyster population. Each year, the Oyster Recovery Partnership field operation transports tens of millions of hatchery-raised, spat-on-shell oysters produced at the hatchery and plants them on hundreds of acres of pre-selected and prepared oyster reefs around Maryland's portion of the Chesapeake Bay. Often employing Maryland watermen with their dredging gear, ORP prepares the oyster reefs for planting and utilizes GPS and sonar mapping to refine planting areas. But building an oyster reef is no simple task, and the oyster restoration has no one formula. Given the focus on cutting-edge innovation, the Oyster Recovery Partnership strategically employs adaptive management practices to customize the needs of each river and oyster bar. A majority of restoration efforts have focused on enhancing oysters' sanctuary preserves. ORP is also actively supporting the emerging aquaculture industry while continuing its support of a well-managed wild fishery. As important as our oyster recovery mission, our partnership also conducts public outreach and education efforts and works with other nonprofit organizations that care about bay health. Each year, ORP travels with our interactive Lil Nippers display and our mascot, Shelly, with her mud crab sidekick, Lucky, to trade shows, schools, festivals, and fairs, teaching children and adults alike about the importance of oysters and protecting our bay. ORP also works alongside eco-minded corporations to research and promote oyster recovery efforts and bay health issues. But ultimately, it's the public like you who will have the biggest impact on improving the health of the Chesapeake Bay. So if you want to leave your legacy on our bay, please visit us on the web at www.oysterrecovery.org, sign up for our newsletter, volunteer, become a fan on Facebook by searching Oyster Recovery Partnership, or simply donate. Over 90% of all donations go directly into the Bay, and our funding sources are diversified through grants from NOAA, DNR, and private foundations, as well as donations from corporations and individuals. A few dollars can plant thousands of oysters. As you may have guessed, with partnership as our name, all of this impact could not happen without our valued partners. Restoring the Chesapeake Bay's oyster population is essential to improving the health of the bay, revitalizing the regional seafood industry, and stimulating the local economies of our state's waterfront communities. Restoring the bay means restoring our oysters, and all the other species that depend on them.